Or without glasses?
Hi, I'm Mike Mascolo. This is Creating Common Ground. Hi, Mike.
Hi,
Oh,
I'm Michael Basseches.
thanks, Michael. So where are we? We're talking about continuing our conversation on how do we, how do people create common ground when one of the parties lacks power, all right?
Mm-hmm.
And we got to a point where we were talking about, the Black Lives Matter movement, and I was making the I was suggesting that I felt that a lot of the language, the official language of the Black Lives Matter movement, contained material that was divisive. Go ahead.
Yeah, if you don't mind my interrupting, just to put in more context. In our discussion, we had talked about the importance of organizing
Mm-hmm.
in especially a less powerful group entering into a dialogue aimed at finding common ground, the value of them being organized. And so we had kind of agreed on the value of organizing.
Mm-hmm.
And as I recall, you had expressed some concerns that some groups in their way of organizing cause damage, make it less likely that common ground will be found. And so
Yes.
the way we ended up talking about Black Lives Matter was as an example of, as I understood it, an
Mm-hmm.
organizing effort that you were concerned about how it was being done and
Absolutely.
risks and whether there was something that could be done to minimize, to mitigate the risks to finding common ground caused by certain kinds of
Right. That's
organizing
right. Yep.
methods.
Yeah, and I think that goes on in the group level and in the individual level as well. But we are focusing on organization and organized groups, and I think it happens all the time. So, good. So, what you had suggested is that I take the language there, and I imagine that if we were creating some sort of a group, that if we wanted to create a movement, not that focused on removing racial barriers and dealing with racism, etc., how would we do it from our own perspective, which would necessarily have to be different from a Black Lives perspective or a women's perspective or an indigenous perspective or something like that. And so I took the I took the language and I looked at the ideas and I simply came up with different. I used it as a springboard to think about how we might want to do it if we were starting such an organization.
Mhm.
Should I bring that up?
Yeah, yeah. Is there a way you can put the two languages side by side on
I'd
the?
rather not.
Okay.
I'd rather not because that makes it feel as though that I'm trying to replace the language. But at the same time, I'll try to do that. I'll try to do that. May be difficult to do.
Because there was a sense that there was something in what you first showed me that needed to be fixed. And
Well, here's the language.
yeah,
Here's the language that I was dealing with at the beginning. Yeah, so it's there. I don't need to put up the website, so it's already there. Okay, so um, so again, we're running the language that I found difficult again was the mission is to eradicate white supremacy. The idea of white supremacy is something we talked about, I think, that I have some difficulty with. I don't have problems saying that America has racism, even rampant racism, systematic racism. I do object to characterizing statements. Statements that characterize something as if it were a trait, an essence, that the essence of something is this or that. Men are misogynist. The culture is racist. That sort of a thing trouble me. Um, and that's where I focused on. And there's also these other things we could talk about. Here's the language I came up with. if we had a hypothetical organization, it would be to transform social and economic and political systems in order to support the flourishing of minority and poor communities.
Okay.
This includes eliminating personal and institutional racism that members of disenfranchised groups experience on a daily basis, transforming law enforcement systems to eliminate a militaristic mindset, remove racial tensions between police and minority communities, and promote relations based on mutual respect and support, creating educational and economic enterprises that allow minority and poor communities to succeed at levels comparable to wealthier communities, support the development of the culture of minority and poor communities as they exist within the broader society. Such an effort would require dramatic transformation in social, economic, and political life, a willingness to engage in honest, good faith, and compassionate dialogue on difficult issues, and for poor and minority communities to work together with more wealthy communities to address the problems of poor and minority communities. I don't like that last line, syntactically. So that's what I came up with.
I misunderstood. I'm glad to clarify. I thought in your version it was both and, that the one was the first paragraph and the other was the second paragraph.
No, because that would make it it's into a Black Lives Matter addendum, right? I don't want to do that.
No, okay.
I don't want to speak for another organization.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So but I don't think that, in fact, that this, in my opinion, this conflicts with this.
Well, yeah. Okay. So let's. It's harder for me to see that if we took Black Lives Matter out of it and we're just working on our organizing principles.
Yes.
I think I would do it a little bit differently. Probably more emphasis on sustainability and social and economic justice, without trying to reify particular communities, because there are many forms and many constellations in which the injustices might take place. But and talking about empowering the disenfranchised, I like that approach. So
well, talk more about that. Talk more about that. I mean, empowering the disenfranchised, economic sustainability. I mean, I wrote this in one fell swoop.
Yeah.
And as a very quick kind of an exercise, it's necessarily wrong.
Yeah. I appreciate
right. And
I appreciate a starting point for some.
Yeah, it's a starting point. And so, ideally, people would look at this and they'd say, we'd have a dialogue just like we're having right now. And what's wrong with this? This would have to be a working document, in any case, right? And the dialogue takes place.
Yes. So right. So the question is, should we first function? I think what you just said about these seem contradictory to you. I have some trouble getting my head around that, just as I had trouble getting around the problem you have with eradicating white supremacy.
Oh, I didn't say I had a problem with eradicating white supremacy. I said I had a problem with the language.
The language.
Eradicating
yes.
white
supremacy.
Okay.
Right. So I'd like to understand that better, and then we can leave Black Lives Matter behind and talk about organizing in general.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But if you look at eradicate white supremacy, I think the word eradicate is the context in which I've usually heard that is with respect to diseases. I don't know if that's your experience too, but the word, because that struck me each time I've read it. Why choose eradicate? And it seems to me that it's taken from a disease model. And so the idea is not that the society is founded on white supremacist principles, but that white supremacy is a disease that is somewhat rampant in U.S. society and others. Well, I think it's most societies in the world. The same disease is rampant.
White
Uh,
supremacy?
yes. Yeah. I mean, just if you look at who's in the government and what roles people play, and any country, like all of the Americas that have mixed races, um, and Europe now, this seems to exist. It has it's a bit different in the U.S. But the description of who's in the government and who's in positions of power and the color of their skin, the same correlations exist everywhere, and I think it can be traced to histories of colonialism and slavery. So there's the same kind of root cause, but to me, the choice of those words is to employ a disease model.
And your thoughts about the disease model? Do you think it's an effective or not effective way of framing the issue?
I think it's less blaming than if it were to say eliminate white supremacists, which would be a murder threat, and would be distinctly not the nonviolent. It would be destroying the other that disagrees, as opposed to.
I certainly have no problem with that distinction that you've just made. I want to go back. I want to talk about eradicate.
Yeah.
I find it difficult to talk about eradicate unless I understand what you mean, what you understand when you see the word white supremacy. What does that word mean to you? Where is the white supremacy? What is white supremacy?
It's in a structure of power in which white people, the two dimensions I looked at. One, who are in the most powerful positions? And if there's systematically more white people than people of color compared to their percentage of the population, I would definitely call that an indication of white supremacy, or describe that as a condition of white supremacy. And if people of color's lives are more fragile, more threatened, higher death rates, more, less less survival of babies, all of those things that sort of suggest that some people in a society are living under a high level of threat to their lives, to their liberty, and that is unequally distributed by whether someone is white or non-white. Those are the two kind of at the far extreme examples.
Okay, if we were to talk about it in and the term white supremacy forces a racial lens on this. So why white supremacy and why not racism? One definition of racism is a system of advantage based on race. And certainly what you just said to me would be able to be captured under that lens, system of advantage based on race. But why white supremacy? My point is this. My point is that, I think I said this before, is that that's a move. It's a rhetorical move that takes a term that has its origins in an extreme, KKK, white nationalists, and appropriates it and uses it to frame an issue that was formerly understood as racism or systematic racism. And in so doing, puts a lens on it that marks the entire range of the thing as in terms of an extreme. So why white supremacy rather than systematic racism? And one more thing, please.
Well, again, it's maybe we're seeing things exactly as mirror images, because I see racism, like most isms, as referring to a philosophy or a set of attitudes or a belief system.
Mm-hmm.
and not to a set of material conditions
Mm-hmm.
or social conditions.
Mm-hmm.
To me, black white supremacy, it could say racial inequality
Mm-hmm.
would be a term that would also refer to a set of conditions. But racism refers to an ideology, it seems
Okay.
to me.
So I like that. Racial inequalities. Okay. So why white supremacy rather than racial inequalities? Racial inequalities does not is a perfectly acceptable for me description without bringing in the rhetorical and the rhetorical and kind of a shifting power idea. I mean, white supremacy is a mode. That's, in my opinion, to appropriately seize power. I mean, you want you want to change. We're talking about how do we do this under differentials of power, and it seems to me that the invocation of the concept of white supremacy is an attempt to do that, but it's an attempt to do that, in my opinion, in a way that distorts the issue. It's not correct. It's not accurate. Um, and it's also not helpful in the sense that you know you're it, you know you when you look at it, you don't see any threat to that term white supremacy. I'll bet you a lot of white people do. Okay, a lot of white people do. So why not choose language that
Mm-hmm.
is says what you want it to say in as much strength and in you, you, that is
You'd even
inviolate.
say racial domination if you wanted it to be more systematic.
Well, I mean, domination in what way? These words all have agentic, qualities to them. You know and in fact, the next sentence here has that agentic quality. Um, that the mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on communities by the state and vigilantes. Okay, inflicted on black communities by the state and vigilantes. Okay, now in my opinion, that's a metonym, if you will. It takes a part and makes it into a whole. It takes a part and makes it into the whole. Can we see examples of the state inflicting violence onto black communities? Well, we certainly can see that if we look at the militarization of the police force and that sort of thing. However, when you say violence inflicted on black communities by the state and vigilantes, it's too simplistic. It makes it sound as though you've got the state, you've got the black communities, and you got this war going on. And that is, it seems to me, the image that is being promulgated here. It's more complex than that. It's much more complex than that. You know, I don't approve of of the use of militarization in the Floyd the Freud Floyd in the Floyd response, but some type of reaction is needed to quell the extremes, right? Of rioting and breakage and that sort of thing. Some people don't like the term riot, and and it suggests an image of the police that the police in some way are characterized monolithically as racist or supremacist, and suggests that that they are focusing on black people to shoot more often than white people. The data on that are not clear. In fact, the data on that suggests, the very little data that we have suggests that given the type of crime, if you look at type of crime, that of those that police officers do not shoot at or kill black people more often than they kill and shoot at white people, and that black officers do not shoot at black perpetrators any less than white officers do. And so when you see these types of statistics, which are not out there in the popular, you see that the image of the dominating force focusing on the less powerful force is more complicated. And this language obscures that. I want to represent it, the force of this of what's behind there accurately, forcefully,
Right, right.
but not with the totalizing language. That's a hard thing to do. That's my
So,
point.
on the positive side of what you just said, my positive reaction to what you just said, which to me, you're saying the description here, the analysis could be much more fine-grained. And that's what we agreed on the first meeting. And so I thought when I invited you to write a paragraph, I think I recall saying to put in the more fine-grained stuff that you think would be important for people to understand.
See, Mike, I didn't see that as what you had asked. I mean, I didn't understand that
Yeah,
if that's
yeah,
what you
no,
asked.
so that was,
But if you did ask that, I would have not wanted to do that, because I think it's the overarching philosophy, the basic metaphors that structure it, that are important. They're more important than the details, because that's the image in our mind. Okay, that's the image in our mind that structures what we do, how we it structures what we do. So if I have an image in my mind of a warring, of a monolithic bad moral force dominating a less one, that's going to bias me in a certain way that, in my opinion, is not appropriate.
well, we can look more at why this language evokes that image in your mind and a different image in my mind, especially looking at the second sentence. We can share what are the images invoked for us by the second sentence. You just did that.
Mm-hmm.
I could share mine.
Please.
But going back to the first sentence, the difference between what was the word? Racial inequities, racial domination, racial inequality.
Racial inequalities is what I would favor more than racial domination.
This, which features the words black and white. And that's, to me, the significant difference. And so in using the term black, they are saying black people are one community and differentiating themselves out from all other communities of color, of various races, skin colors, so on. So that there is an effort, to me, it reflects an effort to specifically encourage black people to bond with each other in this movement, and for it to be a black-centered movement. And the use of the term white, the way I read that is it sort of says, in these inequities of power, it's people with white skin who in general have much more power. And the implicit message is, in order to eliminate inequity, you white people need to be ready to give up more. You need to be ready to cede more.
Mm-hmm.
But let's be clear, if you want to call it, white privilege is something that exists. And in order for this vision to be realized, white people will have to make the choice to recognize and to cede some of that privilege.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether that is
that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, that's the next question. I think, so the goal is to enter into a dialogue about how things could be different. Yeah, I would say it decreases the possibility of the dialogue. But if the dialogue happens, people come in more prepared to consider this issue of what would we need to give up and what are our fears about that?
Mm-hmm.
Which is in fact the conversation we had when we talked about labor management and the founder of the company with all of the time and money invested in that. So probably if the goal of this is to invite the dialogue, that sort of saying to the more powerful party, I want to talk with you, but the kind of talk I imagine having isn't going to be easy. Are you really ready to have this talk? It discourages the dialogue from beginning, but
It sure
may,
does. It
yeah.
sure does. It sure
Um,
does. I want to argue that framing it primarily in terms of power is part of the problem. And I understand that there's a contradiction there. And what we're talking about is dialectics here and resolving the contradiction. The contradiction here is between the fact that there are, in fact, these power differences, if we understand it in one way, but that conflicts with the idea that power struggles don't work out well. They never have worked out well.
mhm.
Power struggles lead to us versus them, which leads to war, which is either metaphorical
Cycles
or
of
real. It's
victims and
happened for thousands of years, and we haven't been able to break out of it. Okay,
mhm.
what is the power that the white community would be asked to give up becomes a question. Um, and I'm not entirely sure that that it's a zero-sum game. I think that when we think about power as somebody has to give up in order for somebody else to get it, we're thinking about that as a zero-sum game. Okay,
Mhm.
and the older notions of equality, in first wave feminism, for example, and in the early civil rights movement, wasn't, if I understand it, I may not, wasn't simply about power, and then we're gonna,
The internet's just started doing something weird where your words were repeating 3 times. Let's try speaking again. Let's see if it
okay,
happens.
is it still doing that?
A little bit, but keep going. Let's see if it's as bad.
Okay, it'll
Speak
correct
with the
itself soon.
same passion you had before.
I don't know if that's a good thing, man. um, so the older models were that where the attempt is to bring the lesser the person the party with less power, less resources, etc., up into a certain sphere, a rising tide lifts all boats or what have you, that sort of rhetoric, where you know where the rise in the power of one community did not mean the diminishment of the power in another community. Okay, so that it's a matter of power isn't a discrete quantity that you give up. If you bring people up, now they have the same. Um, so is there a way to see power in a different way than simply it being a zero sum game? Because when you say to somebody you got to give something up, and incidentally, I'm happy to give all types of things up. You know what I'm saying? The second you tell somebody, you're not entitled to this, you're going to get their back up, and you're going to create more friction, and then
Or
you're
it
going to
would
create
be
more problems.
healthier, I put it in terms, it would be healthier for the whole system if you let go of some of the privileges of your role.
What would be this privilege? What privilege are you talking about that I would have to give up if I'm the metaphorical white community, if you will? What
Well,
what 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 what
a
privilege? What
better
privilege?
chance of being promoted, better chance of better chance of getting into a college or university, um, better chance, and looking at the police situation, I think I think if I faced a police force that
Mm-hmm.
were entirely black led and where 95% of the police were black,
Mm-hmm.
and I had an encounter, I would have a greater level of insecurity about, are these people going to understand me? Am I going to be well treated? Are
Mm-hmm.
my individual needs, whether for medication or eyeglasses or are they going to be treated with the respect? That's a scenario of switching roles, things that I imagine Black people, when they have encounters with the police, feel more frequently, and I don't worry about. I sort of worry about what's the guy's personality going to be like? Is he going to be vindictive? Is he going to be authoritarian? Is he going to be kind and trying to solve the bigger problem as opposed to punishing me? Probably have been pulled over for speeding, so I know I did something wrong.
See, for
So
me,
that's the
then,
kind of thing, but it's more, I mean, I'm all in favor of framing it as how can we learn new ways of relating with each other and new systems, new social and economic systems that will be better for everybody and for the planet as a
mm-hmm.
whole, that will create a better situation for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I do feel like like the whole language of "don't worry, a rising tide lifts all boats."
I
And
never said don't worry, incidentally, but go ahead.
okay, right, but it has been used that way.
Okay.
There has been various things have been a ideological smokescreen erected to obscure the vision. Just say something as simple as the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. To see the distribution of wealth grow and not see that, there are direct benefits. Like who, I saw a headline about Bernie Sanders said that Elon Musk's company, made huge amounts of money during the pandemic. But say who benefited from the pandemic and who suffered, that there were that I do think that in many systems that we've experienced, value is extracted by the people in control from the labor of others, and that's how the inequalities get formed and maintained. So I don't want to be presenting, we're for finding solutions where nobody has to give up anything. And I know you're not proposing that, but I mean, I think I agree in
I
this
may
case.
actually be proposing that. I may actually be proposing that. A basic, you just articulated the basic Marxist principle. I will articulate a basic conflict resolution principle, the principle of mutual gain on the one hand, somehow less effectively and more idealistically represented as a win-win solution, right? And so that in conflict resolution, both sides, you want them not to have to give in on their core beliefs and et cetera, their core needs. You want their core needs to be met, but in a way that is transcendent. I mean, that can't always happen. That
Right.
can't always happen. It can happen a lot more than we think it can happen. Um, don't
Or
get me wrong. I believe that there is white privilege. Don't get me wrong. I believe that there are massive power differentials. I just don't necessarily believe that framing it in terms of you've got to get, because we see you have to give up something for the other person to get it, is a helpful way of looking at it. It frames it as a zero-sum game. All the things you were talking about when you talked about the uh, what is it? Getting equality and getting a job and getting promoted and getting to college and all the rest of that. For me, that doesn't feel like giving up power. It just feels like nobody is entitled. No group is entitled to have that more than any other group.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and
Mm-hmm.
and um, uh, and so it's not a matter of giving up power. It's a matter of doing the right thing.
Yeah.
It actually gives me more power. It actually gives me more power, or gives a community more power to acknowledge that the other party isn't doing well, and you want to find ways to enhance that. I mean, I just don't. I mean, I get it, but the second second you say, okay, you got to give something up, it's not effective. Even if something does have to be given up, but I'm not convinced it does. I'm convinced that I feel more convinced that by creating the connection, by defining myself as someone who sees um, that property taxes for funding education is monstrously scandalous, for example, and that I want to change that type of a thing. If that's simply the right thing to do, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it enhances me, it enhances the other, it
Yeah.
enhances the other. That's what I'm. It's more of a rhetorical thing, I think, on my part.
I think it is right. It is. I mean, I think we probably both agree that we don't want to tilt the board entering the conversation. That the idea that the conversation should be as broad an exploration of what people need, what people are suffering, what they find tolerable, what they find intolerable, what their goals are, what their goals could be. Um, so anything that sort of, in order to enter this conversation, you're already agreeing to certain assumptions besides about the method of
Yes,
conversation,
yes,
will tilt things in a way we would like to avoid.
yes,
I think that there is the paradox, how would I want to put this, that in the conversation, it's important to deal with the tension that on the one hand, we believe that people's relationships and people's self-definitions and therefore their goals and objectives can be transformed.
yes,
And that those transformations are often central to conflict resolution.
yes,
So definitely the offer of the promise of transformation.
yes,
On the other hand, the guards against a kind of persuasion that tells people that they're benefiting from some external perspective and obscures the differences in wealth and power.
yes,
That there's some way, which may be our discussion where it started in terms of the importance of acknowledging differences in power
mm-hmm.
and minimizing them, that they're there from the beginning in the discussion, and we're not going to try to ideologize them away. And we're certainly not going to tell that hopefully we can find what's best for the whole, and we can all find value in that. But it's not anyone's prerogative to tell anyone else what's best for them. You know, that
I'm struggling with what you had said before about ideal making ideology using ideology to structure power. I can't see. Can I say ideology? Say that word.
ideology.
Ideologizing. Say ideologizing, because I can't say ideologizing. Oh, I just did. So ideologizing. To be sure, the Black Lives Matter, in my view, ideologizes power. Okay, that may be the best way to state my objection to it. Okay, it ideologizes power in a certain way rather than another way, and that biases the way in which people think once you internalize that ideology. I object to that because there's many ways of understanding this problem and solving the problem rather than this way. And I find that that ideologies, fixed ideologies, when they clash, lead to wars. Okay, and that's the problem here. It's to break down the ideologies and, if you will, recreate a new one, a new shared ideology, if you will, that does not that each party can see themselves in fully, so that, again, you don't have to, so that the truths of each side, if you will, if that's even a useful concept, are represented in a new shared way of being in the world. And that requires openness. That requires radical openness on both sides. And so when you said that we don't want one party to speak for the other party and tell the other party, this is the way to do it, or this is what you need, that's correct. I certainly do agree with that. At the same time, there must be an openness. There must be an openness on both sides.
Preconceptions, right?
I may not. You know more about me right now than I do, insofar as what my face looks like. Although I can see my face on Zoom. Usually, in a shared interaction, you know more about me than I know about you, right? Because I can't see my face. And so oftentimes the other knows something more about me than I know about them. And so there's this
That's
American
Joe Harry's window. You heard of Joe Harry's window?
I say it again.
Joe Harry's window.
I don't think I have.
It was two psychologists named Joe and Harry came up with this a long time ago. But it's a great schematic for communication. There's what I know that you don't know. There's what you know that I don't know. There's what neither of us knows yet. And there's what we both know. And that the whole point of dialogue is to get what we both know.
Oh, I like that a lot.
Look you find it anywhere.
Yeah.
JOHARI's window. It's good for illustrating this.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So,
but here, yes, I'm beginning to think that this is that I have fears. The different fears are triggered for me than the fears that are triggered for you around this question of ideology. That I really fear the power of neoliberal and other ideologies to distract people from questions of equality and inequality that, a simple catchphrase like follow the money can make clear. I'm more worried about the power of those ideologies. And I see as protective, let's keep track of and let's be honest about who's benefiting and who's suffering from what. The spirit of discussion, let's try to be as honest as we can, not only about our needs and wants and fears, but about, from certain situations that exist, who's benefiting and who's not. And I'm understanding that you're more afraid of the ideology that says you've got to pay attention to these power and wealth differences because they are at the core of problems, and that this ideology perpetuates power struggles, which, as you said, have their negative history, and that we would both kind of, out of our own fears, we would both want to have certain understandings going into a dialogue that would limit the power of either ideology to run amok. Now,
but at the same time, the goal is to achieve some sort of parity in some discursive or behavioral parity between the more powerful and the less powerful party. Of course, that's ideologically defined too, so it gets murky. It gets murky. I'm not sure. I understand what your fear is. Could you say what you're representing? What my fear is?
Yeah,
in 7 words or less.
Words that speak of winners and losers.
Yes.
Let's say a language that was all about winners and losers. That this could perpetuate a zero-sum game of
That's
mind.
one thing. Yes.
Rather
and a language that totalizes, that makes the other into a monolithic agent with a flawed moral identity or with some sort of an evil, malevolent intent.
Well, that's a piece that seems more contingent and easier to deal with.
I'm not sure.
You can say there are inequities of power that without making any claims about anyone's intent or goals.
You don't think that this puts intent? Build local to intervene in violence inflicted on black communities by the state and vigilantes.
Those are the incidents that they organized around.
Yes.
That doesn't say that nobody else, it doesn't say there isn't black on black violence and white on white violence. And,
Michael, this is totalizing language. It is very, you don't think so?
I read it as there are situations that we're very familiar with.
Oh, I can't find that word situations, which we're finally, I can't find that there.
It's talking about when violence is inflicted on black communities by the state and vigilantes. And the goal is to intervene, to have some power, to stop these victims.
You're accepting the language as if it were some description of reality, okay? That the language says intervene in violence. Violence is inflicted on black communities by the state. That is a very simple sentence. Let me finish.
About all violence. It's a statement.
It's easily interpreted that way, and it could be easily interpreted your way. It is unclear. Okay? And that ease of interpretation must be, in my opinion, understood by the drafters.
So simply in that sentence, in situations when either the state or vigilantes threaten or cause harm to black individuals, we want there to be a force that can intervene to protect and to, if they can't protect, at least after crimes have happened, make sure that there is appropriate follow-up.
Okay, that all seems very, very, very appropriate to me, and I could accept that with one exception, and that is in the framing of the how you frame the language matters a great deal. So I can't remember exactly what you said, but it was that the state or the police threaten or harm or some such thing. Okay, all right, but you got to look at the context, right? In what context does the police threaten or harm? There are times when police threaten or harm in ways that are corrosive and wrong, and there are times when police threaten or wrong in response to real threats. Or to other types of ways in which it becomes quote unquote justified. And there are also times, this is very complicated, I'm not going to say the right words, but where the police are acting out, individual police are acting out on the basis of rules that have been developed over long periods of time to solve very complex problems in which They shoot somebody because the rules say you can or that you should,
And
because
that,
your
you know,
life
the
is threatened
rules
in a
are
certain way.
enforced by training in physical
Yes,
habits
yes,
that are
that
very hard
precede the
to.
cop. And those are bad things. Those are really bad things that need to be changed. But then the individual cop gets blamed for following those systemic things. And so there is systemic processing. There is systemic problems here. But again, even those systemic problems develop over time. The reason why you get chokeholds is because, for example, there was outcry about the use of batons, appropriate outcry about the use of batons. So if you can't use batons, what's the next thing? Well, you're going to use other types of more of indirect or less physically violent things. Well, every new problem leads to an unintended consequence. And so you don't solve the problem of how do I deal with the clash. You're going to get new problems coming up, like the problem of laying on
But
somebody.
it's easiest when it's clear, if the two principles, that it's appropriate for police to intervene when a crime has been committed or when there is clear intent to commit a crime. I think in all of these instances, it was not that clear. Secondly, the idea that violence should be the last resort and deadly force, that there's a series of steps to eliminate the threat and to catch the suspect, and that those goals don't trump everything, right? So even if you let go, if you lose a suspect instead of shooting him and have to continue to chase him, that's a better outcome than shooting him, given that he's a suspect, meaning we don't know whether he's done anything or not. So I mean, I think there are a couple of rules that.
It strikes me, I'm not a legal person, but it strikes me that is not legally defensible to shoot somebody simply because they're a suspect. It seems to me that I could be wrong. I don't know what I'm talking about here, but
I don't know. Yeah,
but I don't think you're supposed to shoot somebody unless your life is in danger or somebody else's life is in danger. I think. I could
I
be
would
wrong.
guess that's true, but many suspects have been shot because they were fleeing. This last one at the Wendy's, right? Well, he did turn around with the
And he used a
taser,
taser, all right? That's
right?
not represented very well in the, he used a taser. Or you go to Ferguson, okay, with Michael Brown, you know, I mean, that was, that's commonly represented as a case of police, of the police officer overstepping his case. It's not. If you look at the particularities of it, there was all types of threats to this officer, and he was responding in self-defense.
I don't remember that, and I'm near when I have to stop.
Okay, good.
But in terms of going forward, it seems like there is something with the initial paradox that it is a great tool for organizing the powerless to say, look at what they all have. Look at the lives they have. Look at how we look up to them. Look at how we envy them. And look at the lives we have. And there's some reason. And it's not something that's our personal fault. That's that
Entirely. Entirely.
Yeah.
It's not their personal fault entirely.
I think so.
The person on the person on the bottom is always innocent. Is always is.
If you go to farmers in Uganda, how many do you find that are directly responsible for being in continuous debt and living from meal to meal?
The problems are systemic, to be sure, but I mean, it is not helpful that we do not see self-defeating behaviors and self-defeating acts in let's talk about in many black
What are
communities.
the typical self-defeating behaviors of sharecroppers
I
as a
don't
group?
know. I don't know. That's not what I'm
To
talking
to
about.
me, the biggest self-defeating behavior is failing to organize. And that's why organizing.
Again, when I hear organizing, I don't hear, I don't hear, you know, again, I'm hearing this power, this reduction to power.
Well,
Okay.
it is a tool for organizing to say, look at you, look at them. How do you understand these
And
differences?
that creates the power, you know, the us versus them.
Yeah.
And it creates the intent. The other person's intending to keep me down, where that may be the case, and it also may not be the case. It also may not be the
But
case.
certainly the intention is a different issue. Um, I think many people say, I'm lucky I have a very nice boss and so on. But I think we're still at this place, and what we should do next time is stay with this contradiction that pointing to differences in outcome, pointing to differences in conditions is perhaps an indispensable organizing tool.
Absolutely.
And yet it does
It's how do we
foster
point to
this
them?
we them thinking.
How do we point to them? One of the
Yes.
most beautiful and limiting at the same time conflict resolution principles is if you look at the needs of the people on both sides. So if you look at the needs of poor people, you identify those needs, and you know, if you look at the definition of racism as the system of advantage based on race, I don't see how you could look at America and not see a system of advantage based on race. You have to. I can't, if you go into minority or poor communities, you look at what the needs of the people are, you simply put those needs on the table at first, trying not to deal with ideology. You cannot help but be moved to action, it seems
But
to me.
but I think many Black people have not even thought of it as mentally reasonable to compare themselves to white people. Certainly,
Understand
victims
that.
of colonialism, for Angolans to compare themselves to Portuguese.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like, comparing dogs to mice. It was just, the consciousness feeling like a different species that's meant to live a different kind of life. These obstacles have existed, but I think we're agreed. The question is, by what language can you draw attention to these inequities that come to at huge human costs and that don't need to exist without making, shorthand fostering the us them consciousness, and with it all sorts of things I don't think necessarily follow, that seeing the individual as a bad person.
It's true. What comes to my mind is, us them isn't so bad as long as there's a we that can come of it as
Yeah.
well.
Yes. And that's what Marxism does. I mean, it says we are producing what we need to sustain human life.
But before it does that, it has a pretty big us versus them. Dictatorship of the proletariat, please.
That was
Yes, it was a crummy little manifesto that he didn't mean. Yeah, I understand.
no,
That he didn't take to mean.
no. I'm saying the we, any society reproducing itself with different arrangements, he understood as essential to human being, human life, what makes people people.
Yep.
And so that fact is not a criticism, and he's not criticizing previous historical efforts to organize things, except by their own limits and injustices that caused them to be replaced. And he was saying the movement from capitalism to communism is the next step in this
Yes, but he
developmental
also
sequence.
called on in the Communist Manifesto, called on the workers to unite and overthrow the bourgeoisie. Right.
Yes, and that's the part of the non-cooperation. that rather than accepting operating on the current under the current conditions.
You don't define that to be a violent set of metaphors? It doesn't say, and it doesn't say
Says unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. How much he knew about nonviolence, how much, that's all context. I don't remember Marx writing anything about violent versus nonviolent means.
Mm-hmm.
But
we are now what 160 years, whatever it is, beyond Marx, and so we have the obligation to take his language, if you want to use it, and transform it. Okay,
yes.
And so the call for a dictatorship of the proletariat, or people to bring down the bourgeoisie strikes me as anachronistic.
Yeah, we definitely. I mean, we can definitely fine tune anything, but can we pick up next time with the idea that organizing is important? This pointing to differences between the haves and the have-nots has been a very crucial tool in organizing, and yet it comes with these risks. Mm-hmm. And I think you just said we need to use those tools, but the language could go a long way to mitigating the risks. But yes, figuring out exactly how we do that.
And language is not merely pretty stuff to make the other person feel better. The language structures how we think and what we do.
Yes, yes.
So it's got to be real. It's got to be real. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you, Mike.
All right. Let's contact each other about next. Is Saturday next week? Should we?